Venezuela's economic collapse explained the Venezuelan economy is the worst managed in the world, and although this is a bold statement with strong competition, there simply are no other countries on earth that have squandered such a privileged position so negatively. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves of any country in the world by a significant margin. The second-place holder, Saudi Arabia, would need to find an entire USA worth of oil just to match the reserves of this small South American nation. Now, we have seen many times on this channel before that natural resource wealth does not equal economic prosperity. But at this scale of natural resource wealth, the country could have brute forced its way into the global upper class. Unfortunately, what should have been an easy path to prosperity was wasted, and from its peak, the country has lost more than 80% of its GDP in less than a decade. The collapse has been so severe that many international economic agencies simply no longer collect data on it because the economy has been too poorly managed. It would almost be ridiculous if it were not so tragic. The country is now one of the most dangerous and poorest economies in the world. Venezuela, for a series of reasons worth exploring individually, has become very isolated from the rest of the world. Its people are leaving en masse, and governance has become so unstable that it cannot even access the labor and investments needed to extract its abundant oil reserves. This is a situation that is not getting any better. Toward the end of last year, the country threatened to annex neighboring Guyana, further alienating it from the global community. And now, just at the end of last month, the country held a highly controversial election, raising enormous question marks about who is truly in command. Venezuela is the national equivalent of a lottery winner who is too incompetent even to claim their winning ticket, let alone manage the money once they have it. But if there is more to learn from failure than from success, it is a good starting point. So how did a country with so much to offer end up so poor? Did these problems arise purely from within, or were there external forces pushing for its demise? And finally, is there a realistic way for the country to turn its economy around? Once we have done all this, we can put Venezuela, the world's worst managed economy, on the economic explanation ranking. If you run a business, you know how difficult it can be to manage complex processes and the enormous variety of tools and technologies. Switching from one platform to another and from one app to another for every small task is far from ideal. For most of the country's history, Venezuela has been a petroleum-dependent territory. Even the indigenous people regularly use the oil seeps that came out of the ground to keep fires burning all night or to waterproof their canoes before the Spanish even made contact. After its liberation in the 19th century, the country not only benefited from the discovery of oil, it was the only thing that allowed the government to remain stable through state funding or direct corruption. And for a while, although far from perfect, it worked. Modern Venezuela is one of the most noted petroleum estates, receiving a large part of their revenue from rent paid by foreign companies, governments, and private individuals. Annual production exploded during the 1920s, from just over 1 million barrels to 137 million, making Venezuela second only to the United States in total production by 1929. By 1935, the Venezuelan bolivar soared, with oil becoming the first priority, representing 90% of the country's total exports, which led to a terrible case of Dutch disease, a trend that would remain common until the 21st century. Consequently, the country saw decent growth, although it largely relied on extracting said oil to finance an otherwise unsustainable economy. This also depended on importing most of what it needed in exchange for its oil. While oil continued to be extracted, only 3 foreign companies controlled 98% of the Venezuelan oil industry: Gulf, Royal Dutch Shell, and Standard Oil. The government sought to reform the oil sector to channel funds into public coffers. The Hydrocarbons Law of 1943 was first established in that direction, requiring foreign companies to give half of all oil profits to the state, a move that increased government revenue sixfold in just 5 years. And for a while, it worked. In the 1950s, Venezuela sat at the table of economic superpowers. At the time, they were the fourth richest country in the world. By the 1960s, Venezuela's status as an oil state loomed so large that it joined Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, and Iraq, co-founding the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, commonly known as OPEC. This was a masterstroke in the realm of exports because it allowed them and the countries that followed, such as the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Libya, to determine prices by controlling production to keep prices high. This was technically price fixing through monopolistic market power, but none of these factors really became a problem because they are sovereign entities, unlike a company that is at least in theory beholden to the laws of the countries in which they operate. Venezuela, like the other countries listed, then nationalized their oil industries. For Venezuela, this nationalized entity is Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., or PDVSA for short. All this dynamic was put into play when Venezuela continued to discover oil fields that took it from a modest oil state to the largest oil state in the world. Starting in the early 2000s, this caused a boom in the economy with gross domestic product peaking at $372 billion in 2012. This was fueled almost entirely by these precious exports. GDP, after all, is consumption plus investments plus government spending plus net exports. So how did a country with so much to offer end up so poor? Well, much can be summarized with one word: mismanagement. An example of this would be the government's activities during and following the oil price surge in 2004. The International Energy Agency states that this increase was due to strong demand growth in Asia and North America. It was also not hurt by the fact that an ongoing war in the Middle East disrupted supply chains of other major global suppliers. Venezuela made moves to put itself in a favorable position to take advantage of this increase. The new leadership in 1999 sought to introduce new oil fields, which had become rather stagnant in the 1970s, establishing quotas and taking a hard stance against corruption and bureaucracy. It also dismantled PDVSA after an industry strike in 2002, replacing thousands of workers with people who would embrace the new goal. This left Venezuela full of money, and the government, at least on the surface, sought to improve living standards through very generous welfare systems. Healthcare, food subsidies, and education acted as key representative pillars to show the world and its people signs of strong leadership. With enviable social welfare and rapid decreases in poverty, Venezuela began to appear as an economic success story, especially in the eyes of its people, which was the primary goal of the Venezuelan government, considering faith in these institutions had been destroyed over the last 50 years. With oil prices on the horizon and huge welfare projects in the early 2000s, the country seemed on the verge of becoming the greatest progressive success story in modern Latin America. But there was a big problem. It never really worked, or at least, it was not sustainable. Obviously, when done right, strong exports can sometimes insulate an economy from something like the 2008 financial crisis. Oil, in addition, typically presents low elasticity of both demand and supply, with a complex and costly process of initial oil extraction setup and the fact that people do not have much choice about what to put in their cars, respectively. Venezuela did not suffer much from the cost of setting up extraction infrastructure. Their nation practically floats on oil, which means they did not have to invest in offshore or advanced drilling. They could simply stick a straw in the ground, and crude would come out. What really tipped the scales was spending, and more specifically, how this money was spent. Corruption is a huge problem at all levels, from small bribes to local law enforcement to the national government, and with so much money at stake, there was an incentive to fill people's pockets. The most desirable jobs in the country became government jobs funded by oil revenues because they had the means to misappropriate them easily. Billions of dollars in official account transfers remain unknown to this day, not to mention the more banal corruption happening at the individual level. A 2006 Australian report revealed that a select group of Venezuelan bankers profited from the government's acquisition of Argentine bonds at the expense of the national treasury. Then there are these aforementioned social programs that seem grand on the surface. Government policies were essentially very populist and fundamentally involved giving away oil money to maintain the people's favor. Naturally, this is not bad in and of itself. After all, those natural resources belong to the people, but they made the country very dependent on oil prices, especially when it had to adhere to OPEC quotas. This meant that when times were tough, despite oil prices remaining high, Venezuela managed to dramatically increase its GDP until 2014. But the situation changed drastically when some things started to go wrong very quickly. After increasing for over a decade, oil revenues decreased by 93% between 2012 and 2020. During the same period, per capita income decreased by 72%. In 2014, inflation reached 69%, the highest in the world at that time, and in 2018, inflation skyrocketed, surpassing 130,000%. In 2023, it is still at 190%. Relying almost entirely on oil would always present challenges, but the nation's problems had more to do with how the Venezuelan government managed and continues to manage what should have been a golden opportunity. Obviously, this is where we bring out Norway, the gold standard in managing oil wealth. Both countries own government-owned oil industries, but the fundamental difference is that Norway used its oil to generate long-lasting wealth, while Venezuela did the macroeconomic equivalent of winning the lottery, only to spend it all on a villa and luxury cars. Norway still uses its oil revenues to fund generous social programs, but the only difference is that it first puts it into an investment fund. Instead of using oil profits to fill pockets and give its population fleeting and immediate satisfaction, Norway established the largest sovereign wealth fund in the entire world. Today, it is worth $1.6 trillion, which translates to $1.6 trillion, which translates to 295,000 per Norwegian citizen. Norway also imposed a rule that any spending from the oil fund can only be equal to the expected return, known as the Norwegian 3% rule. This means that the country is not technically spending its non-renewable oil revenues, it is actually spending its conservative investment returns. It also has restrictions where the fund cannot invest in what the country considers immoral, which ironically includes fossil fuels. Now compare that with Venezuela. Without restrictions like the 3% rule, the Venezuelan government could have returned a lot of money to the people in a short amount of time, but the cost of obtaining public and regional approval created a paralyzing deficit. Finally, choosing a personal wealth fund that benefits only a few unsavory groups instead of a sovereign wealth fund that benefits everyone long after oil revenues increase creates an extremely unfair balance of wealth and power. And this is really the cause of many of Venezuela's struggles, as power is distributed and how power is used. Both countries had similar goals when they set out to manage the oil industry. They wanted to use the resources to make the government rich while doing their best to create systems that kept people happy. However, while Norway embraced patient planning and rigorous protocol, the Venezuelan oil industry, although nationalized, lacked the foresight to create regulatory measures that would produce lasting success. So this raises the question, did these problems arise purely from within, or were they caused by external forces pushing for its demise? Historically, Venezuela fell into the trap of giving a bit too much power to Western companies instead of seeking collaboration that would have formed its own citizens to work independently, something Norway observed worldwide, which encouraged them to keep foreign participants at a distance. But this plays only a small part in the economic crisis that Venezuela faces today. Since 2005, the United States has imposed targeted sanctions against Venezuelan individuals and entities that have committed crimes, anti-democratic practices, or agricultural practices in response to the increasing human rights violations and corruption from the government in power since 2013. A prevalent and feasible argument is that the USA has pushed these sanctions on Venezuela more than on other countries because it represents a significant threat to its internal economic system and oil industry. But the impact of these sanctions is only the cherry on top of the growing series of internal failures that fall squarely on the Venezuelan government. And there are a series of examples that can paint a better picture. For starters, the country has the worst property rights in the world, with goods often seized without any compensation. This is terrifying to foreign companies that, in the meantime, have withdrawn from the country because, despite all that oil wealth, it is too risky to do business there. It is like extracting gold from under the smog. Sure, you can make a lot of money, but there are other safer places to get the same thing. Now, it could extract its own oil and has a state-owned oil company, but even that type of work sucks because it has exhausted the smart people to manage it. Brain drain does not even come close to describing the Venezuelan exodus. More than 6.1 million refugees and migrants have left Venezuela due to political unrest, socioeconomic instability, and ongoing humanitarian crises. Educated people have left the country because there are much better opportunities elsewhere that are less dependent on getting a comfortable government job where their goods could be seized at any time or being a victim of political or criminal violence. In either case, the government has bungled, and since then, it has lost many of its skilled workers and cannot get international investments. It is struggling even just to drill oil, the only lifeline it had. The country is now at the top of the misery index, crime is rampant, and inflation is among the highest in the world. The government, desperately trying to maintain power, is only making things worse by doing things like invading Guyana after the discovery of oil and organizing universally criticized elections. And without major changes, who in their right mind would want to live, work, or invest in such a country? So is there a realistic way for Venezuela to change its economy? Well, in light of recent developments, the future appears bleak or, more precisely, desolate. Recently, the government has made efforts to change the constitution, further depriving its citizens of rights to democratic collaboration. This will undoubtedly encourage Western powers to increase sanctions until the crisis is resolved. Without oil revenues to benefit the poor and without a clear game plan to diversify and overcome what is probably one of the worst economic classes in history, Venezuela is a nation with few positives. The country undoubtedly represents the most glaring example of what happens when the resource curse takes hold without anyone in power being able to channel it into something more sustainable. Venezuela's leadership literally had all the opportunities to turn this resource into a source of wealth. If they had managed this wealth like Norway or even the United States or Canada, they could have adequately educated their workforce, invested the wealth in something that appreciates in value, or even created practical infrastructure to support other industries. But they did none of these things, and now it is not only the economy but the people who will suffer for decades to come. Okay, now it is time to put Venezuela in the economic explanation ranking. Before we get into it, we must give a great disclaimer that the World Bank has actually stopped collecting macroeconomic data on Venezuela in 2014 because the country is simply too unstable to be effectively monitored. So for this list, we will use IMF estimates, which, realistically, should still be very similar. Starting as always with size, Venezuela has a GDP of $102 billion, making it the 69th largest economy in the world and getting a 5 out of 10. This is distributed over a rapidly declining population of 28.3 million, meaning the country has a GDP per capita of \102 billion, making it the 69th largest economy in the world and getting a 5 out of 10. This is distributed over a rapidly declining population of 28.3 million, meaning the country has a per capita of 3,867. This represents about a quarter of the global average in the world's richest resource country. This puts it in line with nations like Bolivia, Sri Lanka, and Palestine. It gets a 2 out of 10. Stability and confidence are obviously tragically negative. Between rampant corruption, wasted resources, the world's worst property rights, the mass exodus of the population, global sanctions, hostile attitudes with the direct neighbor, hyperinflation, food insecurity, extremely high levels of criminal activity, and now one of the most condemned elections in modern history, it is not exceptional and gets 1 out of 10 only because it is not actively fighting a civil war yet. Growth has been one of the worst of any major economy in the world over the last decade. Since 2012, the country has lost over 80% of its economic output. It went from a global middle-income power to a desperately impoverished cautionary tale. It gets a 0 out of 10. Finally, industry. It has the largest oil reserves in the world, but it does not have the industry capacity to pump it out of the ground in exchange for money. One of the easiest methods of payment glitches ever, and it did not even manage to input the correct cheat code. In addition, it has no other national industries because everything was crushed by the predominance of the oil industry until it was crushed by total economic ineptitude. 0 out of 10. Overall, this gives Venezuela an average score of 1.6 out of 10, placing it at the bottom, tied with Lebanon, a significantly smaller economy that does not have many of the advantages that Venezuela had. Share your personal experience on today's topic with us. Write it in the comments and ask us any questions you may have, we will be happy to answer. Leave a comment so that we can perfect our creations. We will be happy with your simple like, but the most important thing is not to forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming videos.